What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Cape and Cowl podcast. This is episode 6. We've got a lot of great topics today, and more importantly, I'm going to be joined by the very first guest on the podcast. You probably know him for his Magician's Assistant deck, if not some other decks. I guess give a round of applause, those at home, to our first guest, ObiJohn. Introduce yourself, my friend.
Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm super glad to be here. Thanks for having me on, Blayde.
Sweet. Well, obviously, like I said, you are well known for your decks throughout DC Dual Force, and recently, this past weekend, you took some of those decks out into our first major cash prize tournament, the September Brawl that took place. Lots of stuff to talk about for the Brawl as a whole, so let's start with, what was that experience like for you being a competitor in that tournament?
It was a lot of fun. I've have a lot of experience with competitive card gaming. I've played Magic, Hearthstone, Runeterra, Dragon Ball Z, the Panini one, not the Score Z one. So I'm used to the competitive atmosphere. But there were a lot of surprise decks, and I think that the top 16 showed that there's plenty of surprises.
And when you were kind of getting started, I know a lot of kind of competitive card game players, they kind of just self-sort themselves into teams. Did you kind of find yourself a prep team, kind of like-minded individuals as you were going about preparing for the tournament?
I did, but it wasn't until closer to the event. First, I got hooked up with Combat Panda, and he and I play tested a lot, and I'm glad that he is as patient as he is, because sometimes, kids are still awake. Sorry, I'm running late, or, kids are awake. Sorry, we got to cut it short. And then I ended up getting with Panda, not just Panda, but Swamp, Mr. Robo, and Davey.
And yeah, that's some solid names in there as well. A lot of solid performance in the tournament, so I think you found yourself a good group there for sure. What decks did you wind up bringing? What was your lineup? How'd you go about selecting that lineup? I guess talk a little bit about your personal process for how you went about selecting all of that.
So I kind of took my experiences from the ladder and what I was seeing going on. And I was like, wow, lanterns are really strong. Aura is really strong. And then after talking with Combat Panda and Swamp, they were in agreement. So I decided that I needed to bring a lineup. I decided to target lanterns, as crazy as that might sound. I think in a conquest style format, targeting a specific deck isn't a bad strategy, as long as you run into a lot of those decks. So first I decided, well, if I'm going to try to beat lanterns, I need to have a lantern deck that's good in the mirror. So I decided, how Wonder Woman, I think, is the best lantern deck. Mm-hmm. So I built a version of that also went in with the Aura package. It's kind of double dipping there. Mary Bromfield, I think, is underplayed and underrealized, especially when you're running a Might Energy deck with Yara Floor and some of the other really good Aura cards. You don't just have to go nuts with the lanterns. You can get a couple Aura guys on the board, drop a Mary Bromfield, and you've got a board that's the size of lanterns, and none of them are lanterns.
Yeah, and honestly, even if you pull your own lantern there, like the difference between, because it's a very symmetrical matchup if you're in the mirror, if you guys are pulling similar cards, the difference of a Mary Bromfield there means, your chip and whatever chip buffed now is +2/+2, then the similar cards from your opponent, allowing you to trade over the top of that. And that's just a massive advantage in a matchup like that.
Yeah, and that was what I was going for. So after I got that locked in, there was a last-minute tweak after all the playtesting I had done, mostly heavily influenced by Combat Panda, where I threw Hellblazes in at the last second. But I think that was perfectly fine. Hellblaze is great since the buff.
Oh, yeah.
Then I needed to figure out my second deck. And I had originally had this idea for a Joker Aquaman deck. and it seemed okay. It just didn't really do what I wanted it to. But then I was like, hang on a second. Why don't we try Harley Quinn? And that is where Hammerheads came from.
Mm-hmm.
I started testing it on the ladder, running into lanterns, and I was just smashing lantern deck after lantern deck. And I was like, there is something here.
And that was one deck that I have featured on the channel, and I know we've talked about it previously, but for people who may not know, I mean, when you first grab that deck, and this was a mistake that I felt myself making playing with it, you see Harley, your brain goes, empty my hand as soon as possible. But this is kind of like the rare occasion where you do want to empty your hand eventually, but if a regular Harley deck wants to empty it on turn 2 or 3, that Hammerhead deck, you want to be waiting until maybe, turn 4-ish to really hit your stride. And it's really easy to mess that up because if you dump your hand too early, that deck can run out of steam. Whereas if you kind of play it properly and you hit that correct window, the power level difference between those two situations is just gigantic.
Yeah, because you're gonna, if you hit your emptying your hand on like turn 4, turn 5, a lot of times your opponent's gonna be in a semi-similar situation. Maybe they'll have 1 or 2 more cards than you because you're playing, Cupid and Giganta, so you're discarding cards. But once you're both out of cards, you're in the mid game or late game, and you're drawing 2 to their 1 in a top deck situation, and most of what you have in that deck is just beefy guys and gas.
And it helps you even more in those scenarios as well, because since you're pairing it with Aquaman, the longer you can kind of grind that out, you're drawing 2 cards to their 1, but also on some turns you're playing up to 3 cards onto the board if you're counting the sea creature from Aquaman. So sometimes you're going, even 3 to 1 in those scenarios, which is probably around the time when you start closing the game out rapidly.
Exactly, and that was part of the idea for the deck. Aquaman, he just gets stronger as the game goes on. He's got an attack. Harley has an attack, so you can use them to clear your little guys. You're running some big guys, and a lot of your Anarchy cards, they tend to have lower health. But Captain Cold, I've won games just off the back of Captain Cold,
Oh, yeah.
And a well-timed, adrenaline-filled surprise.
That card was probably the one that stood out to me the most when I saw it in the list, because I am a memer at heart. So seeing a card like that is like, all right, that's the kind of spice that I love in a deck. And it wasn't just like kind of cheeky spice, like it actually worked. And a lot of decks are running solid gold recruits. So being able to just whip that out and have it have speed a lot of the time is just incredible.
Nothing feels quite as good as pulling your opponent's Superman recruit out of their deck and then immediately hitting them in the face with it.
It's like a race to see, can you hit them before they hit the concede button?
Exactly.
All right, so that's your first 2 decks. And then what was your thought process for your third?
So by the time I got Aquaman, Harley, and Wonder Woman Howl into the places where I wanted them, I was really low on time. And before I built the Magician's Assistant, I had played around a little bit with Lex Shazam, and I knew it was a good deck. It's still a good deck. I personally think that it's the most consistent deck in the game right now. You don't have to have the flash combo to win with that deck, though it is the most prevalent way that you see people close out games with the deck. Mm-hmm. So I got with Swamp. He was going to run he ran Lex Shazam as well. We talked a bit back and forth. I convinced him on a few cards. He convinced me on a few cards. And then we pretty much had the same 40. I think he did like one minor tweak after that. I think he put a Shockwave in or something. So we were 1 card off. But mine got banned the whole tournament, which I also expected to kind of happen, having it in the lineup. And I think that deck is rightfully banned because, like I said, I think it's the most consistent deck in the game.
And I didn't get to watch the whole tournament, but from what I saw from around the round of 16 on, I don't think I got to see a single Lex Shazam deck in action, despite it being brought a solid amount. Is that what you saw from throughout the tournament? Did that seem to be the deck that was getting banned everywhere?
I think so. I think Swamp told me one opponent left up his Lex Shazam and he didn't drop a game with it because that deck is just incredibly consistent.
And it's also just a solid deck to have in a tournament setting because I figure you probably want to have something that is consistent. That way, maybe you don't toss it out against the Lanterns, but if, like in your the case with your lineup, you have two decks that you felt very strongly about in your Lantern matchup. So you know, basically, no matter what your opponent bans, you're going to have one of your two decks that you think beats that high roll. So you count on those decks to beat the high roll, and then besides, some sort of high roll Lantern or inmates taking you out, Lex Shazam beats basically all the other slow decks in the game right now, whether it's just by attrition or the flash combo, like you mentioned.
Just about all of them. There are a couple that I think we'll get into in a little bit that I think that deck can be afraid of.
So now you've got your lineup together. You show up to the tournament. As far as your prep goes versus what you saw come tournament time, how did that compare in terms of what you were expecting to see versus what you saw? Or was there some, decks that were brought or that were more common that you weren't expecting that kind of surprised you? I know for me personally, I wasn't expecting him to be the top leader. I was expecting him to be popular, but I was surprised that Batman was the number one brought leader. I guess what kind of observations did you have from your time taking part?
Joker was the big thing to me that surprised me. Because on ladder, Joker doesn't seem to do really great, at least from my personal experience. I didn't see Joker doing very well in ladder. It wasn't until Swamp built his Batman Joker deck, and it was like a 50-50 matchup with Aquaman Harley Quinn that I was like, oh, okay. And then lo and behold, the top 16 has 13 out of the 16 players have a Joker deck.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of a great kind of comparison to draw between ladder play and tournament play there, because I agree with you. When I see Joker decks on the ladder, 9 times out of 10, I just kind of smash their face in. But I think that is the kind of situation of more or less, we'll call it pilot error in terms of playing your firepower cards at the wrong time, probably even mulliganing for the wrong cards, maybe trying to, be aggressive too early instead of stockpile the right firepower cards. Whereas in a tournament setting, the optimal way to play your deck, and that's where you're seeing those Joker turns pop off for, 12, 16 plus damage because they have it all set up properly.
Yeah, and I think there's a deck building aspect to that as well. You can't just jam firepower cards into a Joker deck and expect to do really well. Joker, even though he doesn't do really well, or doesn't seem to do really well a lot on the ladder, people still, I think, respect the threat that a firepower fueled Joker activation can deal. So he also gets targeted really heavily first. So if you can't protect your Joker, you might run into some problems.
Yeah, and I also figure he's probably the type of matchup where, kind of similar to what we talked about with Lex Shazam being a good complementary piece, just having that kind of Joker deck that can push all of this damage out of nowhere, basically coming from a leader ability, hitting opposing boards and opposing leaders. It's probably the kind of complementary, kind of combo-ish deck that goes really well with your more standard, lists 1 and 2 in your lineup.
Yeah, I think that might be why there was maybe so many Joker decks, because he can just come out of nowhere, and especially if you have Enchantress in hand and you get a Joker turn off with Enchantress or Enchantress like plus Deadshot, that's just completely devastating.
So looking at kind of the tournament deck lists as a whole, we've already established, Lanterns are the hot thing. I'm sure there was a decent amount of people who tried to bring inmates if they didn't feel comfortable with Lanterns as their aggro deck. Some variety of either Lex Shazam or Lex Control. I know a popular alternative to a Lex Control is sometimes people play Ivy based control, whether that's with Batman or Cyborg. What was kind of your top meta lists if you had to break it down to say, top 5 decks, if you had to describe this tournament meta, what would you say that would be?
I think the top 5 was Lex Shazam, Lanterns, uh, Tactics Shazam as well. Like, I don't want to just say Batman Shazam or Green Arrow Shazam because there was both. So just Tactics Shazam.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of Poison Ivy Aquaman and Joker.
See, the Ivy Aquaman is a bit surprising to me, not because I don't think that they're two powerful leaders, but I think that could potentially be something that developed more as a result of tournament prep. Because that combination of leaders is one for sure that in my kind of unranked ladder play, almost never see those two put together.
I think Analyze It Gaming had a stint where he did play those two together on stream. I had heard about that. But they're a solid mid-range deck. They both generate free dudes.
Mm-hmm.
And Aquaman has an attack, so you're getting a lot of guys on the board. You have the Tyranny removal package and the Might Big Dudes package. So you're kind of doing the best of both worlds. It's, as mid-range gets.
Mm-hmm. And you got a little bit of that inevitability as well, just in terms of if you're packing those Tyranny control tools, keeping your Ivy plants alive, you're going to be drawing extra cards, dealing damage to both leaders, and then just that kind of tiny bit of chip damage combined with, like you said, 2 free recruits plus Aquaman potentially removing a recruit. That's a +3 on the board on those activation turns. It makes sense that it's almost like a mid-range attrition or attrition through outvaluing in that scenario.
Yeah. Whereas, my Aquaman Harley Quinn was kind of tempo, more like a tempo mid-range or heavy aggro. The Aquaman Ivy is definitely just value town.
And with the power of hindsight, would you have changed your lineup, or did you feel confident that, card draw here, card draw there? Did you feel like you had the right 3 now in hindsight?
I think my lineup was good. I was expecting to run into more Lanterns. I only ran into one person playing Lanterns, and it wasn't exactly a Lantern deck. It was the Batman Hal Jordan combo Storm deck. I don't know. That's I think if I had seen a lot of Lanterns, I'd be able to answer that question a lot better.
Yeah, and sometimes it could just be, I guess we'll call it unluck of the draw, especially in a tournament like this where you wind up in group stages, and I'm assuming this is a lot of people's first stint in, if not specifically DC Dual Force competitive card games, maybe competitive card games in general, in a situation like yours, maybe you just get somebody who might not be as in tune with the meta or is newer to competitive card games and wants to just bring their own list. And if you come heavily teched towards, a specific deck, and in your case, one of your 3 decks was specifically targeting Lanterns and the other one is just good against Lanterns in general, you don't pull that. Now all of a sudden you can be at a disadvantage even if you did have, in general, the correct list. You kind of get unintentionally countered by not pulling that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the drawback for doing a targeted lineup. I was also limited on time currently. So it was just kind of, I was like, this has good chance, so we're just going to roll with it.
And I imagine now for the future, now that you've kind of have your group of people established, your prep time will be much more efficient moving forward. So I think future tournaments, your prep will probably be even more powerful. And speaking of future tournaments, I guess format of the September Brawl as a whole, what did you think about that? And both for a singular event as well as in the landscape of the competitive scene. We'll put that in quotes of Dual Force as a whole and moving forward. What are your expectations, your hopes, your visions for competitive DC Dual Force moving forward?
I liked the way the tournament was run. I think Erlight did a great job. The format, I liked it. It encouraged players to find multiple different styles of decks. So, you couldn't just take Ivy Zat, Lex Luthor Shazam, and then like Hal Jordan, Black Adam, or something. You had to play different color combinations. I think that's lots of fun. I wouldn't mind trying a tournament where you can bring the same color combinations. I do think leader restriction should be a thing. You should only be able to bring a specific leader one time. If Conquest is going to be kind of the standard tournament mode.
So you're saying, for example, let's say I am, like, for me personally, Shazam Lex is my favorite deck. I want to go all in on that. I could potentially go Shazam Lex, Flash Ivy, and let's say Zod comes out and we get another energy leader, or we have Hal. I can go Hal Zod. If, Energy Tyranny is my thing, I can triple lineup of those three as long as I'm switching up my leaders. Right?
Yeah, I think that would be fun. I think that would be good, especially since when you have Conquest format versus single deck with sideboard. It kind of feels similar to me. If you're able to bring three of the same colors, it's almost like a sideboard.
Mm-hmm. And you can kind of, if those two factions paired together is my preferred play style, but I know, my Shazam Lex deck has a weakness against a potential X deck. I can still bring that same deck, but kind of deck 2 is that protect against, this specific bad matchup. Or, maybe my third version is an even greedier version that wants to beat out all control decks or even the mirror. You can kind of address your own deck's weaknesses through your own lineup of kind of the same deck, more or less.
Yeah, exactly. I could also see why they may stick with Erlight's original format for this, though, too. It was really fun and cool seeing all the different kinds of decks that people brought out and the creativity.
Yeah, and as I don't want to call myself a full casual player, but I'm not as competitive as the people who are taking place in these tournaments. So as a viewer looking for entertainment, obviously there's still going to be a meta. You're still going to see particular leader matchups and pairings, but as a viewer, I enjoy seeing that variety of, if we were still in the Batman Wonder Woman times and I showed up to a tournament and it was just Batman Wonder Woman mirrors up and down the board. Yeah, it's still good because you're seeing the best players go at it, and there is inherent entertainment and value in that. But also, I'd much rather see you take the Batman Wonder Woman matchup and, twist that into, let's play. We'll talk about this later, but let's play Flash Doomsday today. And that kind of those unexpected combinations and the new decks that spawn out of that as a viewer is just incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, variety is definitely much more fun to watch and engage in.
So as we're kind of growing, like obviously, early on it's going to be these more community focused events and things like that. But as let's go past early access into post DC Dual Force launch, hopefully, and I expect the game to be doing well, the developers start getting involved in our competitive scene. What would you expect or hope to see in kind of a official developer sanctioned DC Dual Force competitive scene, whether that is league play, tournament qualifiers? What have you seen in other games that work well, and what would you possibly tweak for Dual Force?
So I think that the developers already kind of have their eye on that. I know that it wasn't explicitly stated that the developers did not do a balance patch before this tournament. But I just kind of felt like there being no balance patch the same week of the tournament was kind of like just a nod in the right direction, that they are keeping an eye on the competitive scene and they are respecting community competitive events like that. Oh, and I think that's a really good, healthy thing for the game and the community. As far as what I would like to see, well, we got ranked coming right around the corner. I know that Rune Terra had qualifiers through ranked play. I think that could be something really cool that like builds up to maybe an every 3 or 4 months event, and you qualify through ranked play, or maybe also some side tournaments also could feed into that, almost like a Magic PTQ. You go, you play winner or the top X number qualify for the big event down the road.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the thing that I would want to see as well, because I know obviously tournament versus ladder is two completely different worlds. What makes you good at one versus the other. There's a lot of overlap, but it's different skill sets, different decks across the board. But also when you're forming that competitive scene, if I am a developer, I want to see, my best ladder players go up against my best tournament players, and then have the rest of the field maybe filled out by either some at-large bids. You invite some large content creators to get some eyes on it, maybe some guest spots from other card games, and kind of building out your tournament pools that way, I think is kind of the guaranteed way to make sure you're getting the best of your players from all corners of the game, and as well as kind of maximizing your entertainment factor and your marketing factor. Because let's face it, if you're putting cash money into your prize pool for these tournaments, you want some sort of return on investments besides it obviously being awesome to give back to players. But you also need these to be marketing and entertainment events as well.
Yeah, definitely. The doing cash prizes and having prizes at events, I think, encourages players to try to go for it. If you know that you can buy a couple extra packs and build that deck that you really want to play in this event, or it's going to help you grind the ladder up so that you can qualify and try to get that gold trophy, that's going to encourage you to do that.
Yeah, and I think that little extra carrot to chase can also be the difference between converting a player from potentially a more casual player to a more, if not fully competitive player, at a minimum, a more invested player. Because maybe I don't necessarily care about tournaments, but if I'm somebody that traditionally does pretty well on ladder, and that qualifying spot is within reach or within my eyesight as a ladder player, you're going to get people trying just to see, maybe I'm not a tournament player, but why not try and get that qualifying spot? And I think that kind of just spreads throughout the community at that point and gets everybody involved.
Absolutely. And I think the devs will very likely do something with both ranked play and have side qualifiers, because it appeals to both just the ladder players and tournament players.
And just logistically, it makes a lot of sense too, because unless you pull, depending on the size of your tournament field, unless you're pulling the entire top 16 to try and build out a round of 64 for your, final tournament, which doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. You probably only want to be pulling maybe your top 4. You still need to get more players from elsewhere. So if you have, let's say, 4 tournament qualifiers where you're pulling 4 to 8 players, and then you have at that point 12 ladder finishes where you could potentially pull 1 to 2 players or more, then you fill out your round of 64 real easy without needing to host 12 qualifying tournaments to get up to your finals.
Yeah, and when you compete in an event where you're going to get to qualify, if you come in second, third, or fourth, that gives a little bit of breathing room for the competitor, because you're like, okay, I only got to go 7 wins, 2 losses, and I make it, or whatever it is, to ensure mathematically that I'm in the top X number of players to get an invite. And it helps you relax a little bit. You still bring your A game, but you can relax a little bit. You don't feel as defeated and such if you get an early round loss. So that would be good.
It also just kind of helps you make sure you're getting your actual best players, because there's no guarantee that the top player is going to win every tournament. Bad draws happen, bad matchups happen, but you still want all of your best players to make these final tournaments. So by pulling those top 4 players, you guarantee that even if, what may traditionally be your best player gets a bad break, you don't want to have to bend the rules or change the rules to make sure those players get invited. Inviting your top 4 is a pretty good way of saying, unless you had like the worst luck streak ever, the best 4 are probably more likely than not going to bubble to the top, even if your best player doesn't win the whole thing.
Absolutely. We're playing a card game. Variance is definitely a thing. So pulling from the top group, I think you're spot on with that. That will pull your best players and account for variance.
So moving on a little bit from, competitive scene, tournament scene, but I guess this is an important topic to discuss in terms of both deck building for tournaments, but also moving forward into tomorrow, or presumably tomorrow when ranked ladder drops in the game. I just want to talk a little bit about deck building as a whole. And being that you're one of the more well-known deck builders in the community right now, wanted to start just by saying, when you build a deck, how does it start? Before you get into that mad scientist lab and you start tossing all this stuff together, is it a singular spark of inspiration, a particular interaction? Are you targeting a specific deck that you want to beat? What is your most often formula recipe to start getting in the lab and making a deck?
Well, all the different things you mentioned have all happened at one point or another. I would say the most common thing that probably happens is I either want to solve a problem that I see within the meta, or I just get an idea and I'm like, I want to try this and see if it works.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that piece a lot, because a lot of the times when I go to build decks, and this is more for content decks, not necessarily climbing decks, but you'll just be kind of scrolling through things and either see like, I don't see these 2 leaders together very often. Let's see why. And a lot of times maybe that experiment just blows up in your face and you toss it on the trash bin. Lesson learned for another day. But my biggest thing, especially in card games, is the number of combinations and permutations of cards combining and interactions combining it's infinite. We can never test these things enough. So just because a card or a leader is traditionally thought of as weak, it doesn't mean we've always tried them in all the different possible ways. And even if I wind up being wrong a lot of the time, I think it's worth and valuable to kind of chase those threads down.
Absolutely. That's how Harley Quinn Aquaman came about. Nobody was playing Harley Aquaman together. Little did I know, though, Mr. Robo was also hot on Harley Aquaman, and we found that out after we got together and started playtesting. So that was funny. Even though our decks were very different, both of them were testing well.
And that's another phenomena that I noticed in this community, and I guess it's part of it is our Dual Force community is still on the smaller side, but very interconnected, and a lot of people are talking at all times. As a kind of top-down observer watching things progress, I often see kind of different factions throughout the community, or groups of players that play together, kind of progressing towards the same convergence points. Like one particular deck that I featured from Willow, that Willow showed me yesterday, a Flash Doomsday deck, I thought, my mind was blown when he showed it to me, but as I started scrolling through Discord as we were talking about it and seeing what other people were playing, I saw 3-4 different decks posted by the community that, while not the deck, were either on the right track with leaders and like maybe 25, 30 out of the 40 card lists, or, there were so many people that were so close that, like, even if I didn't find the specific deck from this one avenue, I probably would have found it from another within the next couple days or two, which kind of just shows a lot of people are testing similar things, discovering these new undiscovered places or deck building strategies that weren't previously explored. And it's kind of happening all in this nebula of similar speeds and breakthroughs, which is really cool to observe.
Oh yeah, it's great. Don't be afraid to try out new combos. I have thrown away more deck failures than I have posted or probably will ever post that I found to be successful. And don't be afraid to look and talk to other members of the community and find a group and play test, because when you have a lot of different viewpoints looking at something, you're more likely to come across something that you didn't notice, and your deck will take a step up.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to get your input on, kind of on that topic, is one mistake I think a lot of people make when trying to deck build. Well, I think the biggest mistake is a lot of people don't try to deck build. And not that there's anything wrong with net decking. I think a lot of people can be intimidated by the amount of effort that goes into building a deck. So first of all, that's a mistake. Don't be scared. Try it. But second of all, you're building, let's say, a new concept that you wanted to test or a new idea that you had. I think a lot of people can get into this situation where you put your 40 card list together, you're ready to test it, you take it onto ladder, you lose your first game, you toss the deck out, or you lose your first couple games, you toss the deck out. It doesn't mean that it was a failed idea. Like, it could be something there, and whether it's variance or you need to swat out a couple cards, or maybe the entire idea wasn't correct, but a small chunk of it was, and that's your new thing to build on. When you're testing things, what kinds of things are you evaluating or trying to see where it might not necessarily be straight win-loss, but what are you looking for that kind of flicks that switch for you of like, all right, I think I'm onto something here. There's something here to keep digging into and refining.
Two things: consistency and the engine of the deck. And what I mean by the engine is the thing that makes the deck go and win. So I'm going to tell a small story from back in my Dragon Ball Z days. Anybody that's ever played that card game, it's very different than others. You have like a fighting style and a main character, kind of similar to this, but you still have an engine. And I was playing a Namekian Piccolo deck, and everybody ran the specific card called Confrontation, or the villain version, which was Stare Down. And everybody was running it. And I looked at it, and I ultimately decided to cut that card from my deck because it didn't suit my engine, and it did not accomplish what that deck was trying to do. And when I cut that card, everyone that I played against was blown away that I didn't run the card, but it made my deck run better. So if you can identify cards in your deck that don't assist your engine, you can, again, get, your deck can become more consistent and better at what it does.
Yeah, and I think your DC Dual Force equivalent of that, I guess in card games in general, the overall point is just because a card might be a staple, it does not mean it is a staple for your deck's game plan. So, in the past, whereas before the nerf, cutting Truth and Justice from a deck might have been blasphemy, you have to look at exactly what you've designed this deck to do. And if any particular card doesn't advance that game plan, you have to see, is there another card that advances this game plan better? Maybe sometimes, like Anarchy, for example. If you're building an Anarchy deck and you need some bronze recruits, you may not necessarily want inmates, but as of right now, the way the card library works, you don't have a lot of choice. You're probably grabbing a few of them anyway. So sometimes your decisions might be partially made for you, but that is not the case throughout this game and throughout all the different decks. And there are a lot of cards that we may think of as staples or auto-includes that might not be if you really break down your deck's actual true game plan, strengths, and weaknesses.
And yeah, exactly, and that kind of feeds into the whole mad scientist aspect of deck building. Sometimes you just got to cut loose and try some crazy stuff. Cut quote unquote staple cards. Try out this card that nobody else is playing. Try and see whether this interaction will work really well. And sometimes, not all the time, obviously, but sometimes you'll be really surprised in what you can find that just works, and you didn't think when you initially started building it that you'd get to that point, and now these things are working together. And sometimes that could even be a leader change.
And I think an interesting part of that, and this is a debate that I've had in multiple card games, is sometimes that can even be an inclusion that might be antithetical to your game plan if it helps particular matchups enough. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say you are an all-out aggro deck, or, in other games, you're going for a very aggressive or aggressive mid-range strategy where you would never dream of playing a board clear because it does not fit your strategy. It's not what you want to do. But let's say that particular deck, in your normal matchups, let's say you're a 90-10 win rate, and then against a particular opposing aggressive deck, you are a 10-90 win rate in the reverse. And cutting one particular card and adding an AoE takes your 90-10 win rate, drops it down to 85-15, but it takes your 10-90 and turns it into a 30-70. That's a massive change if that second deck is popular enough. And the argument may be if that second deck is popular enough, you should switch decks. But that's not always, feasible depending on how the meta shakes out. And I just think in general, people don't have enough data, and it's impossible to ever have fully enough data. But there can even be inclusions that seem incorrect if you can tweak out the numbers and calculate, your draw rates and your play rates and find out how they affect your matchups. Sometimes the wrong choice can actually be a net positive depending on what your matchups are looking like.
Absolutely. I like to call what you were just talking about there hidden synergy. Sometimes two things that in no way, shape, or form look like they work well together work exceptionally well together. I think one of the top 16 decks that would be a good example of this is Green Arrow Aquaman. On the surface level, they don't seem like they work really well together, but they actually form an incredible mid-range deck because Green Arrow is giving you removal while Aquaman is giving you that inevitability.
And I think a lot of people see Green Arrow and they think control, and I think maybe that's where he's best. But also, if you think about a mid-range strategy, your number one goal in general is being resource efficient. So in Dual Force, you want to hit your bronze, you want to hit your double bronze, and then turn 3, you want to make sure you have a silver and a bronze. You don't want to be wasting resources at any point. And if you can avoid it, you don't want to be downgrading your resources, so using your silver to play a bronze if you can help it, unless a particular play is too good to pass up. So another thing that Green Arrow gives you in that scenario, if you're playing a mid-range deck, is you can select exactly what arrow you need. He has an arrow for every occasion. You can pick whatever you need to kind of perfectly smooth out your curve. And maybe, even if I have a silver recruit in hand, maybe I want to play a silver arrow on turn 3 so that I can make sure I can play double silver recruit on turn 4 if that's a better play. And it just gives you that flexibility to really be as resource efficient as possible to really live up to that kind of general mid-range mindset.
I definitely agree. Green Arrow, out of all the leaders, is probably the one that enables the most resource efficiency. I do also think, though, that sometimes curving out is really dependent upon your deck and what your engine is. I've played a lot of Energy Tyranny combo, and there are many, many games that I'm just completely fine passing 2 turns in a row, especially if it's like turn 1, turn 2, because I've got a culling in my hand, and I have no problem letting you drop 3 or 4 guys on the board, and then I culling you, and I'm like, okay, now we're in the thick of it.
And I love that you brought that up too, because I think one of the most prevalent things you see in the Discord of people talking about the game is, my hand is all silvers, I bricked, I auto lost. But honestly, I think if I could choose in most decks besides all-out aggro decks, if I had to choose between my starting hand being 4 bronzes or 4 silvers, I think I'm picking the 4 silvers more often than not. Just because silvers on average are going to be that much better than bronzes, I'd rather guarantee on turns 3 and 4 I can play out 3 silvers versus turns 1 and 2 I can play out 3 bronzes.
I think that's pretty accurate. Like you said, except for if you're playing an aggro deck, right? Because you want to get the ball rolling and the pedal to the metal, and you don't want to stop until you see that victory screen. But for control and mid range, not getting bronzes is not the worst thing in the world. I think that control and mid range decks can run less bronze counts overall, as long as you have answers to early game decks.
Mm-hmm.
That are bronze and that you are going to want to see sometimes, then I think that's going to be fine.
And I actually think that's the area of the game that we as a community still have the most room to improve on, is those deck ratios. Like if you go into Discord right now and you post a picture of a deck, you'll get clowned for even having like 7 golds in your deck as that being too high. Let alone you post a deck with like 10 golds in it. And I don't necessarily think that that's wrong. And I think at some point we're going to find that right now a lot of our decks are built kind of like a downward linear. So you're going to have 18 bronzes, 16 silvers, 4 golds, something along those lines. You're going to have a kind of smooth downward trend of bronze and silver similar, but more bronze and silver, and then steep drop off to gold. I think over time we might start approaching more of a bell curve with our deck distribution, where maybe you're pushing 18, 20 silvers and maybe only 10 to 12 bronzes, and then an additional 10 golds in some decks. And right now that seems completely bonkers to even suggest, but I think that might be the point that we start progressing to over time.
I think so, and I think some of the new cards that are coming up are going to help facilitate those kinds of decks specifically.
Yeah, especially that one bronze in tactics that draws your top 5 gold, or draws the golds out of your top 5. Like, I'm already thinking, like, can I push like 10, 15 golds in that deck, since I can filter them out and make sure I'm still drawing my bronzes and silvers otherwise. Like, that card alone is just going to, in the hands of a very good deck builder, that card is going to be potentially the strongest of the mini set.
I am very excited for Brenda. I think she's gonna crack some deck building wide open.
Especially once it gets in the hands of somebody good, and then I can go steal their list once they solve all those mysteries for me.
Hey, it's you do what you got to do, but not everybody is a solid deck builder. I just want to highlight on this. Before I started building a lot of decks, there was a long time in my card gaming career that I would take a net deck and then I would tweak it, and I think there's an eventual evolution into starting to better understand deck building, curves, resource curves, and things like that you can eventually start doing your own. But definitely don't worry about taking decks and tweaking them, because we're all in this to have fun,
And honestly, I think that's something I've heard a lot is, I'm probably going to swap up the names, but I've often heard in card games, there are 3 main skill sets. You have your deck builders, you have your deck tweakers, and you have your deck pilots. Very few people are good at all 3, and often you'll find people who are the best at one are very bad at others. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of other card games I've played, the absolute best deck builders were not the best players. Almost never. But the best players were probably pretty good at deck tweaking, but they were not good at deck building. You would never see top players building this brand new type of deck that you never saw before. So those are 3 incredibly unique and different skill sets that very few people excel at all 3. And if you can be really good at one and decent at another, you're probably already doing pretty well for yourself. So I think a lot of people just need to identify, like, which one of these three do I hit it off with? And if you're just a really good pilot, that's nothing to be ashamed of, because a lot of people, you could give them a top deck and they won't be able to pilot it well. So finding out which one of those three you are, I think, is key to kind of tapping into that joy for card games.
I'm really glad you brought that up. That is 100% true. And that also highlights a reason to have a playtest group. Inside your playtest group, you might have one person that's really good at deck building. You might have two people that are good at tweaking. You might have three good pilots, or some kind of variation thereof. And if you're one of those players that's a really solid pilot, having other players help you get the deck in place is immensely valuable. And if you're a deck builder, knowing that the person in your playtest group is piloting that deck to the best skill possible also helps you to better refine it.
Mm-hmm. And then it's just kind of like that rewarding team setting of like, I love football. So like, if you're a quarterback, yeah, you're not scoring the touchdown, but you get a ton of enjoyment out of being the one to throw the pass and seeing somebody else score. So like getting into that team setting, even if you're not the one holding the trophy at the end of the tournament, although if you are a true card game team, you probably will be together, you may not be the one actually playing the games, but as a team, you're all in it and you all get to take joy in seeing each other succeed. Unless you're playing each other, then it's a win-win.
Absolutely. I've gone to card tournaments, years and years and years ago, back when I played Magic, where I had a playtest group and we took the same 60 cards, and it was like, we were testing it, we were doing it together. And that camaraderie is something that I think is really important in card games. And I think people in general want to get back to having fun social interactions with groups of folks while playing games.
Definitely. And I think digital card games card games in general, if you've got an in-person group, great. But digital card games allowing to bridge that gap across, the world is just an awesome setting for that. Now, we already have ran long, but I don't care. We're going to keep on rolling. I have one more topic I want to get to. We are expecting a patch to drop tomorrow. That patch is going to be a super juicy pack, including ranked subscriptions, daily login rewards, and ranked ladder. With ranked ladder coming out, I have two things I want to cover. The first one being, you are a competitive player. However, what you bring to a tournament and what you bring to ladder, not necessarily the same decks. They don't need to do the same things. How would you define, or how would you explain the difference between a good ladder deck versus a good tournament deck, and how do you go about discerning which one is which?
That's a really good question. And it is, as a card gamer, it is something that is very difficult to navigate, but it's not impossible. So you always have a meta, whether it's on a ladder or in a tournament setting. There's a little bit more guesswork in tournament settings because the meta could slightly shift, or everybody else could be thinking that people are going to bring this. So sometimes there's a little bit more guesswork in tournaments, but generally across both, the meta is the meta. And that being said, on ladder specifically, I think you want a strong, consistent deck, something that you are extremely comfortable piloting, and something that has good game into a large variety of decks, because you're playing a lot of best of ones. You're not doing conquest tournament style or sideboards or whatnot. You only have this best of one chance, and the ranked ladder points are on the line there. So you want the best chance you have to win every match. So those are the things that I would highlight for ranked ladder play.
Yeah, so like in ladder, for example, you might take a deck that's a jack of all trades, master of none, 60% win rate against the field, whereas in a tournament, you might not feel that great about that. You might bring three decks that are, 70, 80% win rates, because you want to make sure if you get the matchup you're looking for, you get that win. In ladder, you just need to kind of ensure you get that win rate over a large sample size versus
absolutely,
a specific game.
Absolutely. And in tournaments, especially with like the conquest format, you get to ban out bad matchups. You don't get to do that ladder.
Mm-hmm.
You got to play bad matchups, and you got to hope that you're going to win at least some of those bad matchups. But as long as you have a positive win percentage, you will climb the ladder. Now, the speed at which that happens, will vary depending upon your win rate. The other thing I want to highlight for ladder play, a lot of people like to take aggro decks onto the ladder because you get more games played in a faster time. I think that that's fine. But if you're not an aggro player and you don't have a good mindset for piloting aggro decks, that's probably not a good idea for you to do, because you're going to do misplays and you're going to lose games that you shouldn't have lost. Whereas if you were playing something that you are more comfortable with, that is more your play style, and that at least has a decent game into a majority of the field, you're going to do much better in ranked ladder.
Definitely. And like, even if you have a 51% win rate with that aggro deck, great, your games are quick. But if you are just barely above the positive win rate, it's still going to take far longer than if you had, let's say, a control deck where maybe your games take 2-3 times as long. But if you're winning 70% of the time, that's still a better ladder deck for you. So you have to figure out, you don't just want quick games. You want whatever the quickest game is that you win with reliably.
Absolutely, 100%.
So now trying to win reliably and as quick as possible, but more so trying to win in general, what decks are you expecting to see most once ladder hits tomorrow? And what decks are you planning on being your core staples for your climb?
So I would encourage players to not take your untested things with brand new cards in them into ranked ladder, unless you really want to give away a whole lot of wins. You need to play test a little bit with it. Take it into unranked, try it out, refine it a little bit before you bring it onto the ranked ladder. Or you might find yourself raging a little bit and be like, "Oh, this deck sucks." Where that might not be the case if you had tested it a little bit ahead of time. That being said, I know that people are going to do it. We all know that people are going to do it. So I expect to see a lot of Blue Beetle being tried on the ladder.
Yeah.
Many of those decks, I don't expect them to be good or effective, but there probably will be some. I think that there's going to be a lot of Flash Harley or Wonder Woman Harley, a lot of those aggro decks, because people are going to want to try to climb as fast as possible. So having something that can deal with those is something I'm looking to do. So Lex Shazam is on my list to play in the ladder. Maybe, slightly tweaked with a little bit more earlier board wipes to stave off some of the aggro. Maybe I might go up to 2 Earthquakes instead of 1, some things like that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think, personally, more than likely, Lex Shazam is going to be my go-to as well, just from a comfort level. And I think it has good matchups against most of the popular decks. Even if you're not fully favored, you still, even your bad matchups, you have a decent chance. So I think that would definitely be my top. I think the Willow deck, for more or less what I'm going to call it, the Flash Doomsday Burn. If you don't see it a lot tomorrow, I think you will see it a lot soon. So I think having a ranked ladder is the perfect opportunity to kind of stress test a deck like that. I've already kind of put out that I think the deck is absolutely cracked. But that's also because we don't really have that incentive to build to counter that stuff yet. So the ranked ladder is the perfect chance for, if this deck comes in, just terrorize the ladder, never loses, people try and counter it, still never loses. That is the best data the devs need to know that adjustments are necessary. But also, there might be some really good counters that just haven't been built into decks yet because there hasn't been that kind of burn pressure to require you to build your deck that way yet.
I'm really excited about that Doomsday Flash deck. So I'm going to bore you guys with a story again. So In Magic the Gathering tournaments, for as long as I know in Magic history, red deck wins has existed, which is just, go to the face, burn, kill your opponent as fast as possible. And throughout tournament history, red deck wins comes in cycles. So for a while, it'll just be completely unplayable. Then it'll completely drop off the radar and people won't pay any attention to it. And then out of nowhere, well, surprise, red deck wins has won a tournament. I think a deck like Doomsday Flash existing is extremely good for the game, extremely good for deck building, because now players are going to have to tweak and modify their decks to account for it. You will account for me kind of situation going on with it.
Yeah, and you need that kind of pressure, like similar to how I think we need something like Lex as a draw engine for late game control. You need something like that to make sure those control matchups actually end at some point. But you also need that pressure on the other end of the spectrum, besides just a normal aggro deck. You need that kind of burn pressure to both get in under control decks to keep them from getting too greedy, so you pull them back in. But you also are so direct and you can get under other aggro decks that you make aggro decks become a little bit more responsible as well. So having those kinds of counteracting pressures across the meta from aggro all the way up to control, I think helps build a healthier meta throughout that spectrum.
Definitely. And when you have aggressive decks like that are prevalent in the meta, it's almost like a status check for any of your deck building that you're doing. You build a new deck, or you're going to take a new deck out. Well, what's your win percentage against this fast aggro deck? If it's like 5% and that deck is prevalent, you should probably be playing something else completely different.
Yep, and it gives you a bar too, because now when I'm evaluating my deck, first thing I ask myself, am I trying to go under this other fast deck? If not, what do I have to make sure I survive those key turns from them, to make sure that I don't take too much damage and that I survive? And then what is my game plan from that stabilization point to recover and win? You have those kind of benchmarks to know, based on this deck and this deck, these three decks, where do I slot into these game plans? And if I don't slot in favorably anywhere, I know that I need to tweak my deck to figure out where I fit into that landscape.
Yeah, and I think that's going to affect deck building. Earlier, we were talking about bronze ratios and gold ratios and decks, right? Do you remember how many golds the Willow Flash Doomsday runs?
Off the top of my head, I think it actually runs 8, possibly more, but around 8.
So that's like a fast get to your face aggro deck running 8 golds.
Yeah, and it's a great example of when I was talking about it with Willow, he said, I looked at this deck and I made sure that every single card in the deck, no matter what I draw, is going to deal damage to my opponent's face instantly. Obviously there's caveats. The deck runs reverse flash. If there's a blocker, you can't go face. But in general, let's assume empty board, and we're both top decking. Willow wanted to be sure that no matter what he drew, it's going to deal damage. So that is a perfect example of where 8 golds might go against your normal aggro/burn mindset. But if all 40 cards in the deck are locked into that specific game plan, your curve doesn't matter as much, because your card selection is so optimized and correct that you can kind of break conventional norms, and synergy kind of elevates you above that.
Exactly. And I want to loop back to earlier when we were talking about deck building and I was talking about engines. This is a prime example of a deck's engine enabling it to propel forward. Everything in the deck deals damage right off the bat. So that is the deck's engine, and it succeeds at what it's doing.
Now, the final question is going to be, and this is the challenge for, the mad scientists like you now. You go into the lab. Is there a solution? Like, you don't want to just instantly come out and nerf the deck. You have to try and solve it first. And that's what I'm excited to see over these next couple of days. What do people come up with to solve this problem? And is there a solution? I am super excited to see how all of that turns out.
I'm excited to take a crack at tackling this monster that's going to be appearing in the meta. The magician's assistant came around because Batman Wonder Woman was so prevalent, and I noticed, well, they have a whole lot of guys that have a lot of health, but Malcolm Merlin doesn't really care about your recruits' health totals and turns pyromancies into board clears.
And finding those kinds of like lesser used interactions a lot of times can just be the answer. Like finding something small like that, it may seem obvious and it may seem like obviously Malcolm Merlin and pyromancy does that. But if people aren't using that enough, just slotting that in sometimes can be the difference of like that can just take out a deck. And if you find that answer, you can completely strike a deck from the meta if that answer is, easy, responsible, and consistent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think we might see made anew?
If any deck is going to get you to run it, I think it would be this one. So if made anew cannot crack it now, I think that is the reverse side of forget nerfing this deck. You might need to buff this card if it can't find a home at this point.
Right? Have it heal 15 or something crazy. Draw 2 cards. I don't know.
I mean, if Doomsday's hitting you in the face for 10, Built Anew is really just undoing one swing from Doomsday, which still is very, very good, but we'll see if that winds up being enough.
Only time will tell. Only time will tell.
All right, well, we covered a ton of awesome stuff today. I'm starting to lose my voice, so we're going to call it an episode for today. I do want to thank you for hanging out with me, Obi. It was an awesome conversation. We'll definitely have you back in the future. But yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with us.
It was a blast, and I'll come back whenever you want to have me.
Definitely sounds good. We will have you back before you know it. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching out there. Let me know what you guys think of our first guest down below. If you have any questions for Obi, drop them down below as well. I'll make sure he sees them, or I'll chase him down for answers. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching and for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.